Hello. The Child Welfare Capacity Building Collaborative's Center for States is pleased to welcome you to this year's Child Welfare Virtual Expo, focused on fostering a healthy workforce. My name is Elizabeth Eaton, and I'm going to go over just a few housekeeping items before we get started today. If you are reading the closed captioning but not hearing anything, try turning up the external speakers on your computer or device. As you logged in and entered the virtual expo today, you may have noticed that there are several areas for you to visit and explore, accessible through the top navigation or from the main home or conference lobby. Because you are seeing me now, we know that you made it to the theater. This is where you can find sessions that match your interests. Keep in mind that we are accessible on your tablet and smartphone, so feel free to take us with you to listen to throughout your day. In your current view, you will notice that there are several windows that you can move around, make larger or smaller, all by clicking on the top right corner of the window. Please note that we'll be featuring several polls throughout our sessions today that will appear in the slides window. And if you have not done so already, we encourage you to set up your profile by clicking on the My Profile tab. This will only take a few minutes. Your profile is where you will access your virtual business card that you can share with fellow participants as you network and make connections. It's also the spot where you can save and store resources in your virtual briefcase to download at the end of the event. You can plan your day by reviewing the agenda and adding sessions to your schedule under the My Agenda dropdown. Between sessions, be sure to visit the exhibit hall and the networking lounge to connect with others. And in the lounge, be sure to share your why on the virtual message board. And just a reminder that we are also on social media today, so please use the hashtag CWVE in your posts as you share your experiences. We also invite you to earn badges by completing activities throughout the day and engage in some friendly competition with your colleagues. You'll be able to view the top scores on the leaderboard in the badge area, accessible through the top navigation. And of course, if you need technical support or assistance throughout the day, you can access staff in the help desk anytime by clicking on Help at the top of your screen. Before we get started, I also wanted to mention that we will present feedback surveys at the conclusion of each session and at the end of today's event, as your feedback is incredibly important to us. And continuing education units are available for 4 of today's sessions. Please visit the Resource Center and click on the tab CEU Information to learn more. Now, please join me in welcoming Maggie Bishop, Executive Director of the Capacity Building Center for States.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for being part of this important event. Before we begin, I also want to thank our partners for their contribution to today's Expo: the National Child Abuse and Neglect Technical Assistance and Strategic Dissemination Center, the National Child Welfare Workforce Institute, the Quality Improvement Center for Workforce Development, and of course our collaborative partners, the Center for Courts and the Center for Tribes. The partnership and planning for this day has been extraordinary, so a special thank you to all of you. Now, I'm excited to help kick off this year's theme of fostering a healthy workforce. When I was a director in a state agency, I saw firsthand the importance of an environment that promotes a healthy and stable workforce. And that includes acknowledging the importance of being valued and respected. And nothing does that more than reminding us all of how critical the work is to the community and the impact it has on the lives of children and families. And now, speaking of impact, I have the distinct honor of introducing Dr. Jerry Milner, the Associate Commissioner at the Children's Bureau and the Acting Commissioner for the Administration on Children, Youth, and Families. Dr. Milner began his career as a case-carrying social worker. He also served as the State Child Welfare Director in Alabama, and previously worked for the Children's Bureau designing and implementing the CFSR. Immediately prior to his appointment, Dr. Milner served as the Vice President for Child Welfare Practice at the Center for the Support of Families. Since his appointment, he has communicated his vision for changing national child welfare practice, which includes a focus on developing a healthy and stable workforce. We're excited to have him talk more about that vision this morning. So please welcome Dr. Jerry Milner.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be with you at the Virtual Expo and to have the opportunity to share with you our vision for child welfare in the Children's Bureau. We have an opportunity before us right now to make child welfare into a system that truly supports and strengthens families and their capacity to care for children in safe and healthy ways. Our vision requires us to reimagine what child welfare is really all about and what are the outcomes that we're expecting from our work with children and families. Our vision is rooted in a firm belief that keeping children safe and healthy requires supporting their families and helping families to build the resilience, the capacity to care for their children, because we believe that in almost all situations, children's families are the best sources of support for children themselves. At the heart of our vision for child welfare is a belief that primary prevention of child abuse and neglect is absolutely essential to avoiding the trauma of maltreatment that so many children in our country experience. I'd like for you to imagine this situation with me. Imagine a young man who, when I interviewed him a while back about his experience in foster care, he had recently been emancipated from the foster care system, and I asked him about his relationship with his social worker. He looked at me and very matter-of-factly said, "She saved my life." I must have looked a little perplexed because he went on to explain to me all the many things that his social worker had done to support him through the years, including helping him through some very difficult times in his life when his own behavior and his own reactions to his trauma that he had experienced presented tremendous barriers for him. He told me about how she had helped him to get through school, to get into college, helped him with finding a job, and even on the day of our interview, after he is emancipated from foster care, how she was coming by after our interview to take him to his job so that he wouldn't risk losing his job for the opportunity to talk to me about his experiences. He looked at me and said very simply, "I'm not kidding. She saved my life." And I believed him. I'm not sure how many of us who work in the child welfare area would have families, youth who have emancipated from foster care, children that we're still working with, who could make that kind of statement about us. All of us who work in child welfare have an opportunity to strengthen our commitment to instilling within our staff and with all the people who touch the lives of children and families a vision of how we can help children and families before maltreatment occurs. Our system is not set up to be one that's focused on primary prevention. Unfortunately, by policy, by funding, and through our practice, child welfare is a reactive system. We respond after the harm occurs to children, after the reports come in to the Child Welfare Agency, after the trauma has occurred. And then our efforts are most often focused on helping families pick up the pieces and to resolve the trauma rather than trying to prevent it from happening in the first place. We believe that we have an opportunity to change that trajectory of child welfare to one that focuses on building the capacity of families before the harm occurs. We also believe that those primary prevention efforts are best implemented at the community level, in the neighborhoods where children and families can have access to the supports that they need on an ongoing basis, where the many partners who affect the lives and the outcomes of children and families every day can come together in a way that services can be integrated and coordinated, and the outcomes can be jointly owned across so many stakeholders. As part of this vision, we also believe that our efforts must focus on not just the physical safety of children who've been maltreated, but on the overall well-being of children and families so that they have the capacity to thrive, that they have the capacity to break some of the very difficult and harmful intergenerational cycles of maltreatment, of family disruption, and of trauma that affect the lives of so many of the children and families that we work with. Because we know that many of the parents who find themselves in a situation of not being able to care for their children in safe and healthy ways have experienced themselves trauma in their lives. We also know that despite our best efforts, primary prevention will not always eliminate the need for children to have the care and protection of child welfare agencies, even foster care. We know that that will continue to be necessary, but we firmly believe, as part of our vision, that even when foster care is necessary, it can function in ways that are far more supportive of families and of the child-parent relationship than it most typically does at this point in time. Underlying this vision that we have in the Children's Bureau for child welfare is the solid need for a healthy, competent, skilled child welfare workforce. And to be clear, when we talk about the workforce, we're talking much more about the range of players who affect the outcomes for children and families, and not only those social workers who are a part of the public child welfare agencies. We're talking about the legal and the judicial community, the attorneys who represent children, who represent parents, who represent the agencies, substance abuse treatment providers, child care providers, other service providers who have the capacity, the ability to impact the experience of children and families in the child welfare system. We have to focus our efforts on this broad range of stakeholders and make sure that they understand and commit to the struggles that children and families experience when child welfare involvement is needed. The skills that we need in the child welfare area cover a range of areas and a range of topics. All of them don't necessarily require a strong research base of evidence to help strengthen families and give them what they need. Often those skills involve treating people with respect, taking the time to ask them what they need, and being willing to go the extra mile in order to help them get the services and the support that they need. It also involves the ability to make very difficult decisions on a timely basis, decisions that are not punitive, but that are realistic and appropriate to a family's situation. And we in the child welfare field must commit ourselves to strengthening those staff and to helping them through the most challenging of situations that we face, particularly when wrong decisions expose them to the loss of personal and professional integrity and even more. If we expect our child welfare staff to help families deal with their trauma and be healthy and thrive, we have to commit ourselves to making sure that our staff and our child welfare workforce have those same capacities. We have a tremendous opportunity before us right now in child welfare. We have the passage of the Family First Act, which is a landmark piece of legislation in our field. Even more so, we have momentum in our field right now and a growing recognition that child welfare, by funding, by policy, by practice, can be more in terms of supporting and strengthening families than it currently is. I'm so pleased to be a part of this virtual expo where the focus is on strengthening the workforce to help us realize that goal. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner. I so appreciate you sharing your thoughts and experience with us this morning to start the conversation, and it's an important conversation that we're about to have throughout the day. And now I am also excited to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Jill Barrick. Dr. Barrick is a professor in the School of Social Work at UC Berkeley. Her research focuses on the relationship of the state to vulnerable families, particularly those touched by the child welfare system. She has written or co-written 11 books on topics related to family poverty, child maltreatment, and child welfare services, and has written extensively for academic journals. Her newest book, The Impossible Imperative, Navigating the Competing Principles of Child Protection, examines child welfare professionals and the morally demanding choices they regularly face in their work with children and families. We are pleased to have her join us this morning to talk about this essential work and the fundamental values that guide it. Please welcome Dr. Jill Barrick.
Thank you so much, Maggie. I am so excited to be here for a virtual conference. What a great idea. There are hundreds of child welfare professionals all over this country right now, all gathered together. You can't see each other, but you're out there and you're across this nation, and the fact that you're spending your time together to learn and to support and to create speaks to the generosity of your heart and your incredible dedication to this field. So I thank you, and I'm honored to be with you today. So my goal this morning is to just set the stage for your day ahead. And I want to share a few ideas about workforce development relating to recruitment and retention, about agency, culture, and climate that might be helpful. I don't really have any special tools. I don't have an innovative toolkit or checklist or some new model of practice. What I want to do with you this morning is to just step back for a minute and to think with you about some of the big ideas in the field of child welfare. And to do that, I want to talk with you about this notion of principles and principles of practice. So what I'm going to do is start by setting the frame. What do we mean by principles of practice? Second, I'm going to illustrate these ideas through a couple of short stories in child welfare. And then third, we'll all think together. How do these ideas then shape how we think about recruitment and retention, about supervision, about our agency's culture and climate? So let's get started and think about what principles of practice really means, okay? So all of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the Hippocratic Oath in the medical profession. First, do no harm. So what is that? That's a value. That's an idea. That is a principle of practice for the medical profession, okay? That principle doesn't ever tell a medical professional what to do. It doesn't tell them what skill to deploy. It doesn't tell them what procedure that they should employ. It's an idea that helps guide their decisions. When they come to a decision point, it helps to guide what the next step might be. Well, it turns out that in the field of education, teachers have a set of 8 principles that they abide by in the classroom. And it turns out that engineers have a set of principles that they abide by in the field. So, child welfare? What are our principles? Have we articulated them? Do we all share them? Is there a common understanding of what they are? I'm not sure we do. When you think about the NASW Code of Ethics, we certainly have that, and that's a marvelous document that helps shape our ethical practice, but it's global, it's large, it speaks to everything in social work. It really doesn't speak to the particularities of child welfare. I think there are principles that guide our work, and I think what we need to do is we need to articulate them more clearly. Maybe we have a couple that we're aware of. There are probably more than 2. And what I want to suggest that once we articulate them, I think you're going to discover that unlike the medical profession or teachers or engineers, enacting our principles in our practice is very, very hard. So first, the good news. I think our principles are inspired. I think our principles are worthwhile. Our principles are felt deeply by our staff, even if we haven't yet articulated them. But there is a cautionary note. There are 3 reasons I think that it's really difficult for us to enact our principles in practice. The first is that in any given child welfare case, there usually isn't just one principle at stake. There's usually 2, maybe 3, 4, 5 principles all at stake at the same time. That makes it difficult. Because the second issue that's related is our principles aren't hierarchical. We don't have one that always prevails absolutely every single time. Our third is that our principles actually are not complementary most of the time. They compete with each other, head on, in a direct collision. And so selecting between them can be fraught. So let me tell you a couple of stories, and that will help us to articulate what the principles are and get our head around how these play out in our work. And I write about these principles in my new book where I lay out 8 principles. I think there are 8. So this is the first place where you might start to disagree with me, which I encourage. Because you might say, no, Jill, there aren't 8, there are 10. There are 12, there are 15. I hope there aren't more than 15 because you know what, we can't do our work with that many. But why don't you join the chat room after the session and you can let me know what I got wrong and what principles I might have missed, or which ones you think need to be excluded. So let's start with our first story. Let's imagine a county where a phone call comes into the hotline, and we have a hotline screener. Let's call her Maria. Maria is a very skilled child welfare professional. Her role is to determine whether and how the county can or should respond to the call that's coming into the hotline. Let's imagine it's a regular day with a good number of calls that come in. Some of these calls are obviously child maltreatment, and she refers them to other child welfare professionals in her agency, and they attend to the case. Other calls that come in are obviously not child maltreatment. She's very courteous, she's very generous, and offers them support and services, but she screens those cases out. And then one call comes in. And it's a woman who reports her niece, who is 17, on the verge of turning 18 in just a couple of weeks. The niece just had a baby. The niece is homeless, and she and the baby are sleeping on park benches every night. They're moving from park to park to park across the city, across county lines to try to find a place that they think of as safe. It's late autumn. It's getting very cold. The caller says that this young woman has no family in the area, no friends, no one willing to take her in. The caller also says that she already phoned CPS in the next county over, and they screened it out. They said, this girl is just about to turn 18. She'll be an adult. She's not our responsibility. Maria listened to this caller's concern, and she wondered about the safety of that infant exposed to the elements. She wondered about the safety of that young girl in park benches at night. She wondered, what does this family need? What supports should they have? She wondered, if we screen this case in, and I send this case to another professional in my agency, what will happen? Will this family stay together, or will this family be separated? Should I screen out the case? Are they sufficiently safe? So she brought the case to her supervisor. Together, they discussed it, and they agreed to screen in that case. And later that afternoon, Maria found that her professional colleague had helped this young woman find shelter for a few nights, that they were working on long-term plans for housing. She now had WIC resources and other nutritional sources to keep her baby healthy and strong. Now, reasonable people might have a very different interpretation of what to do in that case. Indeed, a child welfare professional in another county did. Remember, they screened it out and Maria screened it in, okay? So what were some of the principles at play in that story? The first principle at play, of course, was safety, right? Children should be safe. That is a fundamental principle of our field. She's concerned about the teenager's safety. She is concerned about the baby's safety. But importantly, and this is really important in the United States context, she was concerned about this family's privacy. Their privacy. What do I mean by that? The principle of privacy is that parents who care for their children safely should be free from government intrusion in their family, right? So in the other county, that worker had privileged privacy as the principle. And in Maria's county, Maria privileged the principle of safety. Now, Maria was also concerned, of course, about the sanctity of that mother-child relationship. She wanted to make sure that whatever happens, that family stays together, right? Because family is a fundamental principle of our field. Children should be raised with their family of origin, of course. But she didn't know if another worker in her agency assessing this situation would privilege this principle of family in the same way that Maria might. Why? Not because she didn't believe in the principle of family, but because perhaps the circumstances of safety might suggest otherwise. So when you think about this really simple case, this case that just was at the very, very entry point of our child welfare system, we already have 3 principles at play. The principles are fundamental to our profession, they're fundamental to families, and any professional involved with this case would say these were all important principles, no question. But each principle, if we looked at them standing alone, they tell you to do something different. They tell you to make a different choice. Because why? Because they're in competition with each other. So let's look at a second case. And let's think about if there are other principles that might be uncovered by looking at a different case. So in this case, we have a child welfare professional, we'll call her Leslie, who is regular doing assessments and investigations at the front end of the child welfare system. She gets a new case about a baby who was born at the local hospital who is drug exposed and has a positive tox screen. The baby is showing significant signs of opioid withdrawal. Turns out that the baby's mother is a frequent opioid user, father, regular opioid user. And so Leslie comes to the hospital and her role is to assess the safety of this baby. Not so much to assess his safety in the hospital, he's safe, but to assess his risk of harm if he goes home. And if he goes home with these parents in their circumstances, will he be sufficiently safe? So when Leslie arrives at the hospital and she interviews the mother and the father, and she watches them lovingly care for their infant son. She interviews other staff at the hospital and others, and then Leslie does what any great social worker would do, which is she calls a family team meeting. And Leslie, who has conducted lots of family team meetings in her professional career, is overwhelmed by the experience. This family is huge. There are so many people who come forward to be a part of this family conversation. What she learns is that in this family's culture, extended family play an essential role in raising children. Most of the family members in this family lived in the same neighborhood, they lived in the same block, some of them lived on the same street, and all of them were planning on playing a role in keeping this baby safe. She listened to the family members because she wanted to be respectful of their traditions and their values and their cultures and their views. Importantly, she wanted to honor their voice. What's their perspective on the situation? What's their perspective on how they will keep their family member safe? Well, Leslie talked to the family and she told them about the very serious risks that she was concerned about. She told them about her concerns about this baby's safety if he went home. But she also talked with them about the incredible strengths that she witnessed there in that room. The love, the tenderness they showed toward this infant newborn, their concern for his safety, their close family ties. She learned that mother and father lived in a duplex right next door to grandpa and grandma and auntie. She learned that this family planned to wrap their arms around this baby in a circle of support. So in the end, she decided to have every family member sign a safety plan where they were going to commit to what they were going to do to play a role to keep this baby safe. And the crisis of CPS's involvement even inspired mom and dad to engage or to agree to engage in drug treatment. So a week later, baby did go home. Went home with mom and dad and the whole family. And the family received in-home services for the next several months. About a year later, that mom called Leslie. She said, I just wanted to let you know, baby is thriving, baby's doing great. I just wanted to let you know my husband and I are both now clean and sober. And I just wanted you to know how much we thank you for listening and for being responsive to our needs. Now, Leslie's case is rather different from Maria's, right? But some of the principles that she relied on in her decision-making are exactly the same, right? Safety, once again, the safety principle is at play, and she's trying to determine, is this baby sufficiently safe when he goes home? As she tries to determine safety, what does she do? She turns to the family because she wants to elicit their voice. Voice. That's a principle of our practice. The parents and children of a certain age and maturity should have a say in the decisions that affect their lives. Well, the family assured her that this baby was going to be safe, but there weren't any guarantees, right? I mean, they had 9 months to try to intervene to get this baby to safety, and nothing had happened. So quite honestly, voice was competing directly with safety. She couldn't ignore safety by privileging only voice. In this case, Leslie also turned to another cherished principle that we have, which is she valued the bonds of kinship. Kin, who we have embraced in the field of child welfare in the last 30 years. We're the leaders in the world of embracing kin in our child welfare system. What is the kinship principle? When children cannot live with their family, they should live with extended relatives. And she honored culture. Remember her enthusiasm, her excitement, her curiosity. Tell me more, teach me, let me understand how your culture is important to this family context. And help me understand it because I see so many of its strengths. Culture is a fundamental principle of our work. Families' cultural heritage should always be respected. So some of these principles, kinship, culture, were very compatible with the principle of privacy. Let culture and family attend to this without an obligation to the state and an obligation to us to secure this baby's safety. And of course, we have to return to that principle of family in this case, right? We want to keep this family together if at all possible. But the circumstances of the case were serious, don't forget. The parents hadn't done much to keep the baby safe prior to his birth. So when Leslie weighed her choices, she wanted to conduct her practice in a way that abided by the core principles of child welfare. Again, they were in competition. In the end, she made an appropriate choice, and the baby was safe. Happy ending. But you are all seasoned child welfare professionals who are here today, and you know that this case might have gone a different way. You know this case. You've seen a case like this in your career. What if it had a different ending? What if that baby went home and then was hurt? What if that baby went home and something went very, very wrong and tragedy happened? You know what? In that case, we wouldn't be here talking about the aspirations of our principals and selecting one principle over another. We would be talking about blame. We'd be talking about fault. We'd be talking about error. Something went wrong. She made the wrong choice. She did the wrong thing. So when we think of principles, we are aiming high. But when we talk about blame, we just go low. And then what does that do to retention, right? What does that do for retention? So who wants to stay when you thought what you were doing was principled? Who wants to stay and do their work when you thought you were living in this world of aspirations and values and principles, and you knew it was hard, but you did what was the principled thing to do? And then you find out that it actually wasn't about principles at all. It was about blame. What does that do to an agency culture? I don't think it helps. I don't think it helps. So are there any more principles? That's the question. We have 2 cases now. We've mentioned several principles. I think there might be a couple more. So let me tell you one more brief case, and we'll see if we can uncover a couple of more of these fundamental principles in our field. Okay? In our third case, we have a sibling group of 4. They entered foster care some months ago. The social worker assigned to the case was diligent about working on reunification services with mom and dad, did everything that she could do, but mom was very ambivalent about whether or not she even wanted to parent these kids. Mom had a serious mental health condition. She had a drug problem. She was in and out of the county moving around, and she just wasn't really clear she was up to it. Dad was more clear. He moved. He went to another state, and he was never heard from again. So after several months, the case was reassigned, and our new worker, Sasha, gets the case, and Sasha has a job to do, which is to find permanency for these kids. Permanency. Of course, it's a child welfare principle. We invented permanency in the United States. That concept, right? Children should have a sense of permanence, that the people they live with will care for them permanently. So she asked the children, what do you want? Why? Because she was honoring their voice, our principal. And not surprisingly, they all said the same thing. Just keep us together. We are family. This is who we define as family. So she then, in her principled practice, found a kinship caregiver who was willing to take 2 of the 4 children. Only two, adamant, only two. I have capacities, I have limits, I can't do any more than that. So the kinship caregiver was willing to take the two younger children, but not all four. In order for Sasha to achieve permanency for these children, she was going to have to break with the principle of family for these children and not honor their voice. The two older children had been living in a group home, and that was going well, but Sasha was uncomfortable with that placement. Sasha really felt that it wasn't a place where kids should grow up, and she was determined she wouldn't stay there. They wouldn't stay there. She wanted them in a home. She wanted them with family. Why did she want that? Because that's a principle. Children should be raised in families, in a home, not in a congregate care setting, if at all possible. So she engaged in family finding to see if she could find any other relative who would engage with these kids, and her efforts were fruitless. Nobody was available. Nobody could do this. So Sasha, being the incredible social worker that she is, decided that with all of her advocacy skills, she was going to find the right place. And what did she do? She looked in the community where that kinship caregiver lived, and she scoured that community to find a non-relative foster home where they would take in the two older kids and they would commit to guardianship, permanency. And the kinship caregiver would commit to adoption for the two younger kids, permanency. And the relative and the non-relative agreed that family was important, and they were going to spend their diligent efforts to keep those kids together whenever they could, to meet together, to spend time together throughout their childhood, so that in fact family could be realized. But again, nothing simple about that situation, right? The goal to promote permanency in direct conflict with the notion of family, and in direct conflict with the principle of voice. All of these principles that I've just noted, think about them. Kinship, voice, culture, family, home, safety, permanency, privacy. They're all familiar. They're principles that are embedded in our system. They're in the CFSRs to which we're held accountable. But again, you'll notice something about those principles. In no case that I just described was there only one principle at stake. In some of them there were 5. Oh, for heaven's sake. In no case was there one principle that had to prevail, that always prevailed, or that always could prevail across cases. It was relative. In every single case, it's relative which principles you're vying to figure out, which one is going to prevail, which one will be prioritized. And the third, in every single case, there was competition among them. They weren't complementary. If you look at the extreme cases in child welfare, the heinous forms of maltreatment, you actually do find complementarity. All of the principles align. But you know what? Most of your work isn't about extreme cases. Most of your work is in the middle, in those ambiguous, that liminal space in between. When you think about these features, many principles at play, not hierarchical and not complementary. That's what I want to draw your attention to. Because think how easy this work would be if we had a step-by-step manual that said, in every single case, we will always prioritize. We don't, right? Just think about what our work would be like, though, if we always had absolutes, right? You must always privilege family over permanency. You must always privilege safety over family. You must always privilege privacy over safety. No, that's not what you do. That's not what you do. You don't work in a simple world where things can be put in simple boxes. You work with some of the most complicated families in the United States. You work with families who are struggling with some of the most complicated problems in the United States. I believe that you work with a level of complexity that surpasses any other professional type of profession in the United States. It's not just that the families are complex. It's not just that their problems are complex. It's that the principles that guide what we do for them are complex. In that context, what you do is awe-inspiring. In that context, what you do is jaw-dropping hard. What you do makes me feel small and humble and so appreciative because it is extraordinary. When you really think about the nature of the work, it's nearly impossible. But because the stakes are so high, it's imperative. When we think about how child welfare is described to newcomers to our field, and maybe it's different where you live, but what I have seen in many jurisdictions suggests otherwise. When I see how child welfare is typically described to new folks who are coming on into the field, we speak in these singular terms. In Sasha's case, you know what her supervisor said? Her supervisor said, well, just tell that relative that she needs to take permanency for all 4 kids. No, it's not simple like that. There's nothing simple about it, right? Too often, we talk about our principles as though they're hierarchical. Safety is our highest priority. Really? Family is our highest priority. Really? Too often, we talk about our principles as though they were in harmony. How many of you have you seen this brochure on your table? It says, our work is safety-oriented and family-focused and culturally responsive and participatory. And accept that they're going to fight with each other, right? We don't mention that. Anybody who has worked in this field for a long time, and many of you know that it's much harder than that. It's that ambiguity that makes it so difficult because you are having to make decisions and navigating between competing principles. And that's crazy hard. It's intellectually stimulating, so on a cerebral level, isn't that kind of fun? But on an emotional level, that is so taxing. What's really hard is trying to do this work and do it grounded in fundamental principles, only then to discover that there's no clear roadmap of which fundamental principle you're supposed to follow. More importantly, when we privilege one principle that we find sacred and we discard another, that takes its toll on us as professionals. That takes its toll on families because we thought we were doing principled work, right? And we thought that was elevated and moral and right and good. But I just discarded a principle that I held as cherished. And that doesn't feel right. And that doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel aspirational. It feels wrong. So unless we articulate what it is that we are doing, we're just left with that feeling of wrong. And anybody who feels bad about their work isn't going to stay very long. So we have to talk about principles. We have to agree on what they are, absolutely. I say there are 8, but again, I encourage you to come to the chat room afterwards and tell me what I got wrong. And then we need to examine the circumstances of our families that come before us, and in every single case, clarify which are the principles at stake, which ones am I going to honor, and which ones am I going to sacrifice. Because if we can be more intentional about our work as steeped in principles that are not hierarchical, that are essentially in competition, then we will be more thoughtful about using our rational features, our moral judgments in our work. As a result, I think we'll be more successful in recruiting the staff that we need, staff who are thoughtful, staff who are dedicated, staff who are aspirational, who are engaged. Isn't that who we want? Isn't that who we want? Folks who are drawn to the aspirations of our field? And I think if we use a principled frame in our supervision, we will engage in much more deeply thoughtful conversations about what's really going on and about the nature of the work that we are performing on a much more meaningful level. Because by talking about principles, you're elevated from talking about right and wrong, right? You can't do the right thing if you don't know what's going to happen. And our social workers may be heroes, but they are not psychics. We don't know what will happen. And so we have to remove ourselves from the conversation about right and wrong, and moving to a level of principles helps us to do that. When we have folks who are then engaged in this work because the principles brought them there and because they are enacting them, they're more likely to stay because they're recognizing what they're doing and how they're doing that for our families. And finally, if we have conversations among our peers in child welfare about this, about the fact that sometimes we do privilege some and sometimes we discard others, I think we will shift the culture and the climate of our agencies from blame and error and fault and wrong to conversations about what lies underneath this work. Something that is much more important and more meaningful to all of us. We must remember child welfare work is absolutely essential. It's essential to children, it's essential to families, it's essential to our communities. So the principles upon which we build this profession are imperative. We just can't live in a world of simple platitudes. It isn't honest. And it doesn't satisfy our workforce's hunger for deep meaning in their work. Remember, the principles we've discussed today that guide our work are inspired. And embracing those principles and conducting principled practice is truly an honorable calling. And for that, I honor all of you. So thank you, and thank you for joining this session. We encourage you to share your feedback by completing the evaluation immediately following the session. And after sharing your feedback, please join us in the Capacity Building Center for States booth in the exhibit hall to chat with our session speakers and connect with other participants. Please also plan to drop by the networking lounge to visit the virtual message board and share your vision of child welfare using the hashtag #ShareYourWhy. Then join us back here at 11:30 a.m. Eastern Time to join the session of your choice, collaborating to conduct a workforce needs assessment or coaching for success. We look forward to a day filled with learning, sharing, and connecting. So thank you again for your participation in this year's Virtual Expo.